In last week's episode, we talked about the people versus O.J. Simpson, Downton Abbey, the past and history, and how they all relate to one another. Let's see what you had to say. So before we get into comments themselves, first, a proposal. A couple weeks ago, we did a network-wide survey. PBS Digital Studios made a survey for all of the audiences of its different shows. And one of the things that we learned is that people use Facebook more and more often than we had actually realized. And so I am of a mind to start responding to comments left on episodes of the show on Facebook. The problem being, there aren't that many comments on them. So maybe this is more of a request than a proposal, but if you want to write comments on the posts for each individual episode on Facebook, then I will read them and maybe they will end up in the comment response videos. What do you think about that? I think it sounds fun. Okay, so now on to actual comments. On the subreddit, akoboldskobold started a really great conversation about the nature of truth as it relates to textbooks versus people who are telling stories about history. But I wanted to focus on something that Bobart, the creator, mentioned, which is how we judge truthfulness in history textbooks. I just want to flag this because of the idea that a history textbook doesn't necessarily have an agenda, and I want to emphasize that unfortunately, at least in the United States it seems, I'm not sure what it's like in other countries, is not the case. There are no shortage of textbooks, and at least in the recent past, there have been no shortage of controversies surrounding the things that end up in textbooks, end up left out of textbooks, or end up misrepresented in them because of, it seems, either the politics of the people who are writing and publishing them, or what is more likely, the politics of the market that is likely to purchase the largest number of these textbooks. A recent one, and one that a lot of people might already be familiar with, was a controversy in Texas where slaves brought to America were described in a textbook as immigrants and workers, which I would say is not even a misrepresentation. That is just factually incorrect. That is just plain not true. And then there's other stuff that you can argue is less egregious, but is still really awful. There was a controversy when I was a kid about a textbook that devoted, I think, 4 fewer words to the entirety of the causes of the Great Depression than the entirety of the baseball career of Cal Ripken Jr. And the whole controversy surrounding that was about why someone may or may not want to have a textbook that spends a significant amount of time discussing the economic and social causes of a period of great economic collapse in American history. And I just want to flag this because I think it's important for us to always have a reflex when we look at something and we think, oh, well, that's, has less of an agenda, or because of where it ends up, we assume that it doesn't have an agenda. And I think those are the things that are the most insidious and worth just trying to be sure that that is the case, because I think often it's not. Alfarius, also on the subreddit, writes a really great comment connecting the past history and game worlds that you create when you're playing a tabletop role-playing game. And I really like this comment because it gets to this idea of the personal experience or the interior experience of history, and that there are things that in both situations, history, tabletop role-playing games, that people around the table, so to speak, can agree have happened, people or characters that did exist, events that transpired, but there's a certain kind of interior experience of those things that you can't account for, and that will be different amongst the people who have experienced them. And I think the idea of current GM as historian in some way, or keeper of the past, is a really, really interesting idea. So this is a great comment. Thank you for writing this, Alfarius. DestinyQx and a bunch of other people brought up Hamilton, which is a great sort of test case for these ideas about the past and history and the relationship between getting at the truth of something, as Downton Abbey might, without necessarily, dealing with the complicated nature of facts. And I think that there is a lot to talk about, especially as Hamilton relates to the identities of the people who it portrays and the truth of maybe what they were about as divorced from who they are, which I think is, you know, part of at least how I understand the popularity of the show. But yeah, this was a great comment. Thanks for writing this. Links to this one and all of the others in the doobly-doo. Charlotte Lucy Holland draws a comparison between history and mathematics, and this was actually something that was in last week's script that got cut. We ended up going with the comparison between history and art and historians and artists, but the other comparison to make is that history kind of exists in the same weird transcendental ether or weird transcendental space that, you know, the number 5 exists in. You can't point to 5, you can't point to the past, but there is a set of people who are able to operate on those things in such a way that it gives them meaning and allows them to act in some way for the people who need them. And I think the reason that we ended up moving away from that comparison is because we tend to associate math with logic and the idea that when you are working with numbers, you're working with things that are completely divorced from human input and our feelings and emotions, whereas with history, it's impossible to get away from those things, as is the case with art and artworks. But yeah, I think insofar as their existence, there is a great comparison to be made between mathematics and the past/history. Maylua writes a really great comment about the relationship between history and archaeology, which I highly suggest reading. They also let me know on Twitter that there is apparently some controversy as to whether or not Homer was even one person, which blows my mind. I had no idea that there was a possibility that Homer is just an aggregate for some literary ideals that existed in the past, which would have been a great thing to discuss in an episode about the construction of the past via history in the present. Man, missed that one. To We Take 831 and everyone else who pointed out that we messed up the Rurouni Kenshin asset, we're very sorry. Ian was, our editor, was in the comments also apologizing, which he doesn't have to do. It's a team effort here, and it's just, we sometimes just lose track of all of the assets that we put in the episode, but that's no excuse. We should know what we're doing. We should not be putting things in the episode unless we're positive about what they are and where they came from. And, you know, this is a lesson that we've learned now 4 or 5 times. So thanks for bearing with us. Sorry. Matthew Potter, Flint Makes Music, and a bunch of other people were surprised that the episode didn't contain any mention of the very well-known phrase, history is written by the winners, or written by the victors. And the reason it wasn't included is, there's 2 reasons. So the first, as Kai Halud points out, is that I think it's less and less true. People like Howard Zinn, blogs like Medieval POC, and other more skeptical or interventionist practices of history point out that more and more we understand that history is not necessarily something that is reported from the perspective of people who did well or who were successful, that it is fundamentally something completely different. And so the second reason that we didn't mention it is because I think that there is an ethics to understanding history that way. That is, when we start to understand that history is not necessarily made by people who had access to the creation of knowledge, who had access to audience, we can get closer to this idea that history is fundamentally made from the perspectives of people, and that it is worth investigating as many of those perspectives as we possibly can, not just the winners and not just the victors. So I hope that that assuages some of the surprise or upset that we didn't talk about that very idea. So I would love to know what someone who was involved in what happened in Ferguson thinks about the difference between it being called a riot and it being called something else. I think it's worth noting that the Wikipedia entry is titled The Ferguson Unrest. Something to consider. God27 we are gonna probably do something like a story dice contest like we did for the holidays, but postmodern somehow. So we'll release that as a Friday video at some point.